This recording is Chapter 4, Part 2 of 3, The Tissue Level of Organization. Whenever scientists talk about epithelial tissue, they describe it according to its characteristics. Most commonly, we use two words to describe epithelial tissue. The first word is going to describe the number of layers of cells involved in that epithelial tissue. We do this by looking at the basement membrane at the bottom of the epithelium. If there is one layer of cells above the basement membrane, we simply refer to that as simple. If there is more than one layer of cells above the basement membrane, we say that is stratified epithelium. As I mentioned previously, we're going to use two words to describe the epithelium. The second word is based on the shape of the cells. If the shells are flat or squat in appearance, we call them squamous. Here we have one layer of flat or squat cells. We call this simple squamous epithelium. By the way, the word epithelium is singular, epithelia is plural. When we look at numerous cells above the basement membrane and we look closely at the cells at the apical surface, because these cells start to flatten out, we refer to this type of epithelium as stratified squamous epithelium, because the term stratified refers to the fact that there are layers. If the cells above the basement membrane are only, again, in one layer and they are cube-shaped, we refer to that as simple cuboidal epithelium. If we have more than one layer of cells above the basement membrane and they are cube-shaped even at the apical surface, because we're always looking at that apical surface to determine the shape of the cells, then we refer to that as stratified cuboidal epithelium. The difference between stratified squamous epithelium and stratified cuboidal epithelium is that stratified squamous epithelium tends to have many cells in layers. Stratified cuboidal epithelium tends to have between 2 to 3, occasionally 4 layers of cells, but more commonly only 2 to 3 layers of cells. So that's one way that you can determine what type of epithelium you're viewing under the microscope. Lastly, we have cells that are shaped like columns. If we have one layer of column-shaped cells above the basement membrane, we call that simple columnar epithelium. Notice how the nuclei in these different cells appear. In squamous epithelium, the nuclei of the flat cells tends to be elongated. In cuboidal epithelium, the nuclei of the cells tends to be more circular. In simple columnar or columnar epithelium, it depends. However, the nuclei of columnar-shaped cells tends to be located a little bit more towards the bottom of the column and maybe oval in shape. Here again we have simple columnar epithelium. And similar to stratified cuboidal epithelium, when we see stratified columnar epithelium, usually there are only 2, potentially 3 layers of column-shaped cells. With stratified columnar epithelium, these are true layers of cells. If you take a look at this particular picture to the right of the stratified columnar epithelium, you'll notice the term pseudostratified. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium is false layers. Technically, the plasma membrane of every single one of these cells is going to contact the basement membrane. That means that even though the cells may appear to be layered, they are not. And one of the ways that we look at this in our lab is if we see cilia on the apical surface of the cell, that's also a giveaway that we may be viewing pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. In looking at simple squamous epithelium, it's important to understand where we find simple squamous epithelium. This is where we have membranes that line ventral body cavities, the endothelium, which is the inner lining of both the heart and blood vessels, parts of kidney tubules, inner linings of the cornea. By the way, the cornea is the clear part of your outer portion of your eyeball. Also, the alveoli, which are the tiny little air sacs inside your lungs that allow for gas exchange. Those are all made up of simple squamous epithelium. What is the function of this? Well, with one thin layer of flat cells, that helps to allow for diffusion to occur easily. So we have diffusion of substances as well as reducing friction, because we know that this is going to be found in the mesothelium, the membranes lining the ventral body cavity. And so we have reduction of friction. It's also going to allow for absorption and secretion, and it helps control vessel permeability, which means allowing things to go in and out of different vessels. Stratified squamous epithelium, I always say layers mean protection. So when we have lots of layers of cells, and again, if you look at both pictures on the left and the right, you'll notice that the cells at the very top, the apical surface, they flatten out, and that's how we know this is stratified squamous epithelium. Here's the basement membrane. So if we go from the basement membrane and look up towards the apical surface, you'll notice how those cells at the apical surface flatten out and become squamous. So stratified squamous epithelium is obviously going to be on the surface of the skin, which is called the epidermis. It also lines the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the rectum, the anus, the vagina. I used to tell my students in lab that high traffic areas, right? Because you get a lot of abrasion on your skin, high areas of wear and tear. If you've ever eaten a crunchy Dorito or a chip, you can sometimes feel it braiding the inside of your mouth, and as that travels down the esophagus to your stomach, it's also going to have some abrasive force. So again, the functions for stratified squamous epithelium include providing physical protection against abrasion, also providing physical protection against pathogens and chemicals. Cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium, if you again look at the location of the basement membrane and go towards the apical surface, which on this side is going in this direction towards the lumen, okay, we count one layer of cube-shaped cells. And we find simple cuboidal epithelium in glands, in ducts, in portions of the kidney tubules, the thyroid gland. And these are just some of the places, it's not inclusive. And so we have limited protection, secretion, and absorption with simple cuboidal epithelium. Stratified cuboidal epithelium, again, take a very close look at this, because you'll notice that when we see stratified cuboidal epithelium, there may only be 2, maybe 3 layers of cube-shaped cells going from the basement membrane in towards the apical surface, which is that inner clear dot in the center. That's a free space, that's a free surface. So stratified cuboidal epithelium lines some ducts. It's actually common in sweat glands, and it functions for protection, secretion, absorption. And that takes us to transitional epithelium. Now, the word transition means to change, undergo a change. Transitional epithelium is very commonly found in the urinary bladder, because if you imagine the urinary bladder filling up with urine, it's going to stretch and expand as it fills with urine. And we see transitional epithelium not only in the urinary bladder, but also an area of the urinary system called the renal pelvis. When urine is produced by the kidneys, it collects in this area that kind of looks like a staghorn, okay? And so this collecting area is called the renal pelvis, and that also is lined with transitional epithelium. The ureters are the tubes that carry the urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and they are also lined with transitional epithelium. So it's going to allow a stretching and recoiling, or expansion and recoiling, when substances are either filling or moving through. Interesting, the ureters actually will function by peristalsis, just like your intestines. So if you were to stand on your head after drinking a glass of water, as your kidneys are filtering your blood, they'll produce urine from that glass of water that you drank, and the ureters will actually push the formed urine upward against gravity towards your urinary bladder by way of peristalsis. In this particular picture, you may notice there are some cells in transitional epithelium, and those are called umbrella cells. You may learn a little bit more about umbrella cells in AMP2. I'm just throwing that term at you now so that when you get there, you'll remember it and you'll say, oh yeah, I heard that before. Columnar epithelium is obviously going to include cells that are shaped like columns. When we look at simple columnar epithelium, anytime you've got a cell that's thicker, whether it's simple cuboidal epithelium or simple columnar epithelium, one of the functions is going to be protection. So simple columnar epithelium is going to act for protection, secretion, and absorption. It doesn't have to have microvilli or cilia on it. It depends on where it's located. However, we find simple columnar epithelium in places like the stomach, the intestines, the gallbladder, uterine tubes, the collecting ducts of kidneys. And in this particular picture, we can see those tiny little microvilli on the apical surface of these cells. Compare that to the much larger cilia, because remember, microvilli increase surface area to increase absorption, whereas microvilli are larger and they move stuff across the surface of the cell. Some people missed that on the homework, and I really want to drive that concept home for you. When we look at pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, this obviously has cilia, it's in the name. This is going to be found lining the upper respiratory tract, which includes your nasal cavity, the trachea, the bronchi, as well as parts of the male reproductive tract. That's where we can also find pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. The function of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is for protection and secretion. When we look at stratified columnar epithelium, just like we saw with stratified cuboidal, not a lot of layers, maybe 2, maybe 3 when you look under the microscope. And stratified columnar epithelium is going to be found in parts of the pharynx, which is your throat. Please be careful. The word is pharynx, not pharynx. You'd have to stick an extra N to make it into a pharynx. That does not exist. Also, larynx, not larynx. Let's get it straight. We have pharynx, epiglottis, anus, mammary glands, salivary duct glands, the urethra. Those are all places where we can find stratified columnar epithelium, and its purpose, its function, is for protection. We talked previously about goblet cells, and we said that goblet cells produce mucus. So when we look at these goblet cells, if you can imagine a goblet containing mucus, that mucus appears clear under the microscope because it doesn't absorb stain. So these goblet cells are basically unicellular exocrine glands. They're secreting their product onto a surface, whether it's internal or external doesn't matter. It's going into a surface as opposed to in the extracellular fluid where it would be picked up by the bloodstream or lymphatic fluid. The vesicles inside the goblet cell are going to secrete proteins that are called mucin. And this mucin is a real large macromolecule, and it's glycosylated, so it's got sugar attached to it. And mucin is a big portion of mucus. And in these goblet cells, we've got a lot of well-developed rough endoplasmic reticulum, as well as Golgi apparatus, because remember that mucin is a protein, and this is going to be produced by the rough endoplasmic reticulum so that it can be shipped to the Golgi apparatus and then transported out of the cell, because remember that the rough endoplasmic reticulum produces proteins either to be incorporated in the plasma membrane or to be sent out of the cell by way of exocytosis. And that's exactly what happens with mucus. And remember, mucin is protein, so that's why we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum with the ribosomes producing the proteins. We see a lot of goblet cells in the intestines to help move digested food through the intestinal tract, and we also find it in the respiratory tract. In the respiratory tract, the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, in the upper portion of the respiratory tract, the cilia actually sweep downward towards your throat, towards your pharynx, whereas in the lower respiratory tract, it's going to sweep upward towards your throat. The idea is that when pathogens are inhaled, when they get trapped in the mucus, if it goes to your throat and you swallow it, your stomach acid will basically kill the pathogen. Pretty cool system. We know that glandular epithelia is involved in glands, and there are two types of glands that are categorized based on whether or not they secrete their product externally onto a surface or even on a surface internally in the body, such as the digestive tract or the respiratory tract. And then we've got glands that will secrete their products around the fluid surrounding the cells, which we refer to as endocrine glands. The prefix endo means inside, and endocrine glands are glands that have cells that when they produce their product, the product is released by the cells into the extracellular fluid surrounding them. By the way, extracellular fluid is often also referred to as interstitial fluid. So please get used to that term. Interstitial fluid, extracellular fluid, basically interchangeable. Here we have a picture of an endocrine gland that is producing its product in the form of hormones. And as the gland secretes those hormones, they're going to diffuse into the bloodstream and be carried through the bloodstream to their target organs as blood circulates throughout the body. They could potentially also be picked up by lymphatic fluid. So endocrine glands do not have a duct. Their secretions are released into interstitial fluid, and hormones are the most common type of product that is secreted by endocrine glands. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, actually have a passageway or a duct, and that duct will allow the secretions to be discharged onto the epithelial surface. This includes things like sweat, milk, tears, digestive enzymes, saliva, mucus, and sebum. Let's take a closer look at these. In terms of exocrine glands, we've got three kinds of exocrine glands. They are categorized based on how they release their product. When we look at salivary glands, we can see that salivary glands, which are referred to as merocrine glands, merely secrete their product onto the apical surface of the cells. Mammary glands are a good example of apocrine glands because when mammary glands secrete their product, it's not just the product that gets released, the apical surface of the cell is released with the product, hence the term apocrine. Finally, we have an example of a sebaceous gland. The sebaceous glands in our skin are associated with hair follicles, and they produce an oily substance that we call sebum. When sebaceous glands release the sebum, the entire cell is going to break and burst apart and be released with the sebum, and those are referred to as holocrine glands. The whole thing goes. When we look at exocrine glands, we can see that they can also be characterized by the structure of the duct, how the secretory area is shaped, and also the relationship between the duct and the secretory area. You'll notice that they come sometimes as tubular shapes, coiled tubular shapes, branch tubular shapes. Some may be shaped like little sacs, so we refer to those as alveolar or acinar, and they can be compound. I'm not concerned that you memorize the fact that sebaceous glands are simple branched alveolar exocrine glands. That's too much minutia, but I did want to point out on this slide that they come in different shapes and sizes. That's important to understand. Here's another picture of those. And again, if you want to read about them a little bit more, and you can see that mammary glands down here on the bottom are much more involved in their configuration than intestinal glands up here on the upper left. Okay, and so the salivary glands as well are much more involved in terms of their structure than the glands that we find in the intestines. So it's kind of fun to read about where you'd find them. Again, I'm not concerned with you memorizing where you find these. Here is a chart of the epithelial tissues that we discussed previously, so I'm not going to go over that. However, if you wanted to print out a chart for yourself, you could find this in the PowerPoint presentation that doesn't have me recorded on it. I also did put a chart for histology, and histology is the study of tissues on Blackboard. You may want to print that out. Let's look at the tissues and see what we have here. Some of these are a little tough. I know what they are because I'm used to looking at them. Let's start on the upper left, and this is actually a picture of simple squamous epithelium found in the alveoli of the lungs. The cells tend to be somewhat flat in shape. There's a single layer, and even though it's tough to see in this picture, the nuclei are going to be more flat as well inside those cells. This particular slide right here is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Not every cell touches the basement membrane. Usually in lab, if you see cilia on a slide, it's because they're trying to show you pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We usually, at least in the past, have not used stratified columnar epithelium that has cilia on it, that would be really tough to distinguish for beginners in anatomy and physiology. I know this is transitional epithelium. How do I know it's transitional epithelium? Well, there's lots of layers of cells, first of all, which is very common with transitional epithelium. If I compare the apical surface where the cells aren't really flat here compared to this slide down below, then that means that this one's going to change shape. So this slide here at the upper right is transitional epithelium. The slide at the bottom right is going to be stratified squamous epithelium. The slide here on the far left in the middle is simple columnar epithelium. How do I know? Well, here's the basement membrane, this dark line down here, and I've got one layer of columnar shaped cells. If I look closely, I don't know if you can see this dark line here on the apical surface. That's actually microvilli. If I look at the middle slide, I've got stratified cuboidal epithelium. Here's my basement membrane. Remember, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar tend to have 2 or 3 layers of cells. So if I look here, I can count, here's 1, here's 2. If I look over here at this slide, here's my basement membrane. I go towards the apical surface. I know these are columns, and I see 1 nucleus. It's easy to count the nuclei, and 2 nuclei. That's stratified columnar epithelium. Here at the bottom left, if I look at the basement membrane and go in towards the apical surface, which is that hollow area inside this circle, I can see there's only 1 layer of cube-shaped cells. So I know that is simple cuboidal epithelium. Now this is a tough one. That's actually simple stratified, I'm sorry, that doesn't exist. Simple squamous epithelium. You can't have simple and stratified. That means there's 1 layer of many cells. Yeah, no. So here we have simple squamous epithelium, and in the top left slide, what they tried to do was get the view of the cell like this, but on this view, it's actually looking down on the cell, kind of like a fried egg. So this is simple squamous epithelium. Yeah, please be careful not to say simple stratified. It doesn't exist. That was my error. Connective tissue connects. It's going to function to connect the epithelia to the rest of the body. It also provides structure, support, and protection while also helping to store reserves of energy for us. Connective tissue is important because it also helps transport fluid and other dissolved materials and defends us against microorganisms. In this slide up here, we actually have dense irregular connective tissue. The slide below is a slide of blood. Blood is a fluid connective tissue. There are 3 basic components of connective tissue, including cells, extracellular protein fibers, and ground substance. All connective tissue is going to arise from embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. Connective tissue doesn't have a free surface because it connects things together. The fluid surrounding the cells is referred to as the ground substance. The combination of the ground substance and the fibers surrounding the cells makes up what's known as the extracellular matrix. Most connective tissue is highly vascular, which means it's got a great blood supply, except for cartilage and dense regular connective tissue. Those types of connective tissue don't have a good blood supply. Therefore, it's harder for them to repair themselves if an injury occurs. Connective tissue is never exposed to the outside environment, and the molecule known as hyaluronic acid is important in connective tissue because it helps to lubricate the fluid surrounding the cells, the ground substance, by attracting water molecules to it. That helps keep connective tissue lubricated and can vary the degrees of viscosity in the ground substance of the connective tissue. Here we have a picture of the different things that can be found in connective tissue. You can see different cells, such as the macrophage listed on the left-hand side of this picture. The term macrophage means big eater. You can also see a fibroblast. Fibroblasts are responsible for producing fibers. We see a mast cell, a lymphocyte, a fat cell, which is known as an adipocyte, as well as a neutrophil. Let's take a closer look at some of these cells. Looking more closely at the cells involved in connective tissue, we see fibroblasts are responsible for producing protein fibers. However, once those protein fibers are produced, the fibroblasts turn into mature fibrocytes and maintain the structural integrity of those protein fibers. Macrophages are big eaters, and they eat up bacteria, pathogens, and cellular debris, and they do that by phagocytosis. Fat cells, which we will hereon refer to as adipocytes, store lipids. You'll recall that we said earlier that one of the functions of connective tissue was to serve as an energy reserve. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells that will help more connective tissue cells be produced. Mast cells are special cells that release different chemicals. Mast cells will release heparin, which prevents blood clotting, and histamine, which causes vasodilation. So vasodilation means the blood vessel is opening up. So two chemicals released by mast cells, heparin to prevent blood clotting, histamine to allow blood vessels to vasodilate or open up, are released by mast cells during an inflammatory response. We also find different cells of the immune system besides macrophages. We see lymphocytes, eosinophils, and neutrophils, which are also going to defend connective tissue from invaders. We can classify connective tissue in three different ways. We have connective tissue proper, which is a connective tissue that is made up of many types of cells and fibers in a syrupy ground substance. That includes loose and dense connective tissue proper. We'll look more closely at those. We also have fluid connective tissues where cells and proteins are suspended in a watery matrix. This includes blood and lymphatic fluid. Those are both fluid connective tissues. And then we have supporting connective tissues where there are fewer cell types, more fibers, and we see this in cartilage and bone. When we look at connective tissue fibers as one of the three main components of connective tissue, understand that there are three types of connective tissue fibers, including collagen fibers. Remember, collagen is the most abundant protein in the human body. Collagen fibers tend to be long, straight, unbranched, very flexible, very strong fibers. We see collagen fibers in abundance in structures like tendons and ligaments and aponeuroses. We also have reticular fibers. Reticular fibers, remember the word reticular means network, and these are branched fibers that are more delicate. They produce a framework that not only helps to stabilize the positions of cells, but also provides a three-dimensional structure for organs that are not supported by a muscular wall. For instance, your intestinal tract, your digestive system, has a muscular layer that supports the structure of that tubular system. your liver, your spleen, your lymph nodes, bone marrow, and the area around capillaries doesn't have that muscular wall. Therefore, the reticular connective tissue helps to provide a three-dimensional structure for those organs. Finally, we have elastic fibers. Elastic fibers tend to be branched, they are wavy, they have the ability to stretch and recoil, and we find these often in elastic ligaments, skin, lungs, large blood vessels. Areolar connective tissue is a loose connective tissue proper that contains all the cell types and fibers, and they're arranged in a very loose fashion. One of my students once said that looking at a slide of areolar connective tissue looks like spaghetti and meatballs in its appearance. The cells in areolar connective tissue include the mast cells that release histamine and heparin. And I did not mention before that histamine not only causes vasodilation, it will also increase the permeability of capillaries. Remember, a capillary is the tiniest blood vessel in the body. You could fit 10 in one strand of hair. So increasing capillary permeability means that things can leak out of the capillary wall more easily when tissue damage occurs. We know that heparin prevents blood clotting, and the release of histamine and heparin from the mast cells occurs when there is tissue damage. We also see fibroblasts in areolar connective tissue, fibrocytes, leukocytes. Areolar connective tissue has a very thick or viscous ground substance. It can distort without being damaged, which makes it very resilient. And it's found in the superficial layer of the dermis and between organs as well as around blood vessels. It has a very extensive blood supply. Looking at adipose and reticular connective tissues, these are also loose connective tissue proper. The adipose connective tissue, as you look at the two pictures at the top, we know that adipose connective tissue consists of cells known as adipocytes, and it is found deep to the skin, especially on the sides, the buttocks, the breasts, and padding around the eyes because they sit in a bony socket, and around the kidneys because the kidneys are so close to the back. Adipose connective tissue helps provide padding and cushion against shock. It insulates our bodies, it reduces the loss of heat, as well as forms a storage site for energy. Reticular connective tissue is the type of connective tissue that makes up soft organs that don't have a muscular wall. So the liver, the kidney, spleen, lymph nodes, bone marrow, these are all comprised of reticular connective tissue, where we have these delicate protein fibers called reticular fibers that make up a little network of fibers throughout the tissue. And somebody said that it appears like a bunch of grapes under the microscope. Some people say it looks like cherry blossoms. When you're identifying things in lab under the microscope, if something strikes your brain as looking like something, write that down and use it. That will help you recall it when you're being tested. Dense regular connective tissue is comprised of lots of collagen fibers that are tightly packed together, and they're usually running in the same or similar direction. That's why they have the term regular, because everything's arranged very regularly. Because these collagen fibers are packed so tightly together, dense regular connective tissue does not have a good blood supply. We find dense regular connective tissue between skeletal muscles and the skeleton, forming structures known as tendons. Tendons connect muscle to bone, as well as in structures known as aponeuroses. And aponeurosis can also connect muscle to bone or muscle to muscle, or it may wrap around certain structures to help provide support. It's a flat band of dense regular connective tissue. We also see dense regular connective tissue in structures like ligaments that connect bone to bone, as well as the deep fasciae of the body. So dense regular connective tissue provides a firm attachment, helps conduct the pull of muscles, and reduces friction between muscles, as well as stabilizing the position of bones when movement occurs. Dense irregular connective tissue has lots of thick collagen fibers that are going in different directions. Because of the different directional arrangement of dense irregular connective tissue, blood vessels can go through that connective tissue. So dense irregular connective tissue does have a good blood supply. We see dense irregular connective tissue forming capsules around our organs inside our body, including the periosteum, which is a connective tissue on the surface of bones, the perichondria, which is a dense irregular connective tissue capsule on the outside of cartilage. We see this in sheaths that cover muscles as well as nerves, and in the dermis of the skin. Your skin is made up of the epidermis, which is what you can touch. Underneath the epidermis, which is made up of epithelial tissue and is avascular with no blood supply, we have the dermis, where we have a good blood supply. That means if somebody gets a shallow paper cut, it won't bleed if it's only in the epidermis. There's no blood vessels. If it goes deeper into the dermis, then there will be bleeding because it could cut into a blood vessel. Dense irregular connective tissue helps provide strength to resist forces that are applied in different directions. And it also helps to prevent different structures from overstretching, like the urinary bladder. With elastic connective tissue, we see elastic connective tissue between the vertebrae of the spinal column in a structure known as the ligamentum flavum, as well as the ligamentum nuchae, and also in ligaments that support the penis and ligaments that support transitional epithelia. So we have dense irregular connective tissue involved with the urinary bladder and elastic connective tissue involved with the urinary bladder. The elastic connective tissue is also found in blood vessel walls, especially with large blood vessels that have to expand when the heart contracts to push blood out. We see that elastic connective tissue helps to stabilize the positions of the vertebrae in the spine as well as the penis, and it helps to cushion against shock and allow for expansion and contraction of organs. This ends this series of Chapter 4. We're going to start with the third part in the next recording.